Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast. This is episode 21 of the Church Fathers. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me and support me on Locals, where you can engage with the channel and get regular updates as I post with an email notification. Sometimes Google, YouTube doesn't always update you, even though you subscribed and hit the notification bell on my channel. A lot of people have been complaining about that, so keep that in mind as well. So Logos and I are going to go through chapters 41 to 55 of the First Apology. So 40 is pretty short, or at least my notes on it. David predicted that Christ would be crucified, and he goes through a lot of biblical passages. Those of us who are Christians, these are pretty self-explanatory. I don't really feel the need to go into all of these at the moment. Oh, sorry, 44, here we go. No, that's 54. There we go. Crucified predicted. There's by David. Now we're going to the next one. Prophecy in the past tense. 42. Why is prophecy communicated in the past tense? Because God has revealed to the prophet that these things would happen. So certain is the prophet that he speaks as if the events had already happened. And then there's an error, whether it's an error on Justin's part or a transcribal error. I don't know if we can tell anymore. David was not 1,500 years before Christ, but 1,000. So however that error crept in, who knows? Christ was crucified and then rose again. Classic Christian doctrine here. A lot of the apology is just explaining the basics of Christian doctrine to a pagan. So some of this is going to be pretty basic, but some of it isn't. Chapter 43. Men have choice. They must choose between good and evil. They will be rewarded accordingly, well if good and ill if evil. There is no fatalism in Christianity. If man had no choice, he would not be blamed for doing wrong or praising for doing well. Plants and animals do not act with choice. Okay, 44. Prophecy does not nullify choice. God, 1, knows what people will freely do, omniscience, and 2, degrees certain outcomes, omnipotence. Human freedom is preserved between these two facts. The devil used fear to prevent men from reading the prophecies found in the Hystaspes, Sibyl, and the Scriptures. All right, Logos. So what do we got on this?
Yeah, so going back to 43, this is the free will discussion that you and I have had in lots of different contexts. And what I want to focus on is just his argument for it, not attacking or defending the position itself. Because it's one of the first church fathers we've seen that actually broaches a topic, which is a huge hot button issue to this day in philosophy of religion. Um, if people don't have free choice, how are they morally culpable in some broad sense in terms of salvation, damnation, and so forth? And Justin seems to agree with the consensus today that, well, if people really couldn't have done it otherwise, then, surely, sending them to hell or whatnot is just evil, you know. Um, so that's where everybody agrees. And so what Justin's going to try to do is argue that they do have free choice, especially given he spent so much time in this document outlining various prophecies. Here's all these future acts that God had to know was going to happen, whether it's just the destruction of Jerusalem, whether it's that they crucify Christ, you name it, God knew it thousands of years in advance. And so the obvious question is, well, if God knows this stuff in the past tense, it's already happened to him, um, could it have done otherwise? And so, like, here's a question. It's like, let's just think about Judas. Judas betrays Christ. Judas gets in big trouble. But if Christ knew in the past tense that Judas would betray him, it's like it's almost like Judas was always in trouble in the past tense. Judas could Judas have done otherwise? These are all the big questions. So here's Justin's argument. So he says, we see the same men making a transition to opposite things. Now, if it had been fated that he were to be either good or bad, he could never have been capable of both the opposites, nor of so many transitions. So that's the first argument he makes. He makes a second one in a later bit, right? So the reason why this argument isn't very good, regardless of what you think of the position, is that it's conflating something subtle but major. Um, when people are asking about could they have done otherwise, they don't mean could they do otherwise at some point in time or other, right? So if I do an evil thing in time 1, say I'm Paul and I'm evil and I'm persecuting Christians and doing terrible things at time 1, I come to Christ at time 2. It could be the case that God foresaw and prophesied that Paul fatalistically must have tormented Christians, but then uh, God prophesied that Paul then must convert to Christianity and he was going to be his next messenger after the disciples, so to speak, right? So if every single one of those events, the transition, was prophesied by God, the fact that he did so from time one to time two doesn't really have any bearing on the discussion. Instead, let's take Paul's example and say, well, let's suppose that Paul died, like he was persecuting Christians, and like he died like very soon after. He never converted. It's like an alternate timeline, right? And Paul gets in trouble. It's like, he dies and he never converts and he goes to hell or whatever. And the question is like, well, could Paul have done anything different? Because in this timeline, is all we know is that God foretold he would be a great persecutor of Christians, not that the other thing would happen. Well, now we don't have time one to time two, and Paul moving to do an opposite. He does the thing at time one. He dies. There's no transition, right? The question is, at time one, could Paul have done something else instead? Not could he have done something else in the future in time two. At time one, could there have been another path for Paul where he was saved? Because if there was no realistic causal other path for Paul, then from the moment of his birth, he was just funneled to the place he ended up. And
Right. So real quick, can I just interject?
Sure.
So to follow your argument, what I think you're saying is this, and just correct me if I'm mistaken in this.
Sure.
You think, and I would agree, I think if I'm correct, that the real choice about free will is could you do anything different at, say, T sub 1?
Right.
But what Justin is saying is, well, because we can do something later in the future, which is a different end state than the state we started at, that's a different kind of question than what we're typically dealing with in modern religion, free will and religion debates today.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think Justin has this really weird reading of Plato and Platonic assumptions, where the crux of his argument seems to be the idea that things do not partake of their opposites, and so you are you over time, and you can't be other than you are, right? And so he's trying to say is, well, if you are you at time one, and you are you at time two, and you at time one is doing good, and you at time two is doing evil, or vice versa, then it must be like an innate property of you to have always been able to do good or evil at time one or time two, in order to make that work. Because I think what he's trying to say here is something like, if you had always been ordained to do good, then because things don't partake of their opposites and evil is the opposite of good, you never should have done evil at time two. It would have been contrary to you, and things don't partake of their opposites. And likewise, if you were always ordained to do evil, but you do good in the future, then you never should have been able to do good in the future, because again, that which is you doesn't partake of its opposite. And so what he's saying is the fact that people can do good at some times and evil at other times means that good and evil are both like ontological properties of your being at every point in time. That's kind of the Platonic argument I see he's trying to make here. And what I think he's rightly argued is that at every time humans have a capacity to do good or evil, and I think the gap that's missing here is it is that capacity to do good or evil that is used by God to make the future the way He wants it to be. Suppose it's necessary for God that Judas betrays Christ in order to make the resurrection happen, and so on and so forth, right? Well, if Judas had some ontological property that he was just incapable of doing evil at any point in time, well, then Judas could never have been a machination for God's plan, right? And so what Justin has pointed out is that at every point in time, Judas has the capacity for both good and evil. And at sometimes, Judas has the capacity for good while he's following Christ, say, and he needs at least one other time for Judas to have a capacity of evil to betray Christ. And so that capacity for good and evil is going to have to be assumed at all points in time in the conversation. And that's, I think, where Justin's argument gets us. But what I don't think he has the language to quite understand yet, being, so back far in history, is the language of counterfactuals. And could something have been otherwise if done over, or if there's like an alternate like timeline or something else? Very abstract stuff that we take for granted that he wouldn't have known to think about. So he got there, but he didn't quite get there.
Okay, 2 points. One, I think the next chapter does indicate something about counterfactuals, which I'll point out when we get back to that. The other thing I want to say is the part of this chapter that you and I have talked about before is the sort of basic intuition that there must be choice involved, because you don't condemn a robot or a dog for doing the wrong thing,
right,
or the right thing, because one is programmed by a human to do something, and the other one is just a brute that can't make choices. So it's just a sort of basic intuition, one that I share and agree with, that you have to have choice. And then the next step is making the argument. And I think
Yes.
what you've drawn out here, Logos, is through the process of ratiocination in philosophy, we've moved a long way since 150 AD.
Yeah.
And again, that's just where they were. Like, to get to a higher level of thought, you have to like go through a lot of steps. And so this isn't necessarily a condemnation of Justin. It's just,
Nor the position.
yeah, or his position. It's just where the meta was at 150 AD,
Yes.
or wherever. Now,
And then
this is,
oh,
go ahead,
sorry.
sorry.
And then the other thing he did, so he made two arguments. The first argument he made was just that people have the capacity to do good and evil at all points in time. The second argument he says is, but not even would some be good and others bad, since we thus make fate the cause of evil, and exhibit her as acting in opposition to herself, or that which is already stated would seem to be true, that neither virtue nor vice is anything, but that things are only reckoned good or evil by opinion, which, as a true word shows, is the greatest impiety and wickedness. Okay. So now this is kind of interesting here because he's kind of moved away from a Platonic argument and now he's moved on to basically what we call it a kind of like a pragmatic argument, where um, people can't really believe that they're fated to do everything they do because that leads to the idea that um, okay, let's do it this way. Think about it in terms of like A theory or B theory of time. So like A theory of time is like time is tensed, it's moving along. There's like a future point from where you are and you're kind of getting to that future state. B theory says like the whole timeline's already happened and you're just like observing points on the timeline. Now the idea is if everything is already laid out as a point on the timeline, it's hard to call things truly evil because all you can really say is that tenselessly this fact happens at time X and this fact happens at time Y and this fact happens at time Z and so on. Um, it's hard to really talk about. So the reason it's hard to call things evil is because, evil things are that which ought not to be done. That's one definition, and the good is that which ought to be done, which is another definition. Um, but if the timeline's already pre-planned out, and we're all just kind of moving along the railroad tracks, those notions of you ought not do this or you ought do this become irrelevant because all that exists is what's going to happen, not what we ought to change or not to change. And so what he's saying is a pragmatic argument that if you really believe this and follow through with your worldview here, you lose the entire ability to talk about things in moral terms, about what things ought to avoid, ought to change, and so forth. But nobody lives that way, is what he's basically saying. Not only does nobody live that way, but the Bible doesn't say that people should live that way. So people can't blame Christians for living that way because the Bible tells us how to live. And so you misunderstand our doctrine. And he's saying, you can't believe this about us if our worldview is true because you don't live that way, even if you've like heard us talking about our prophecies and so on in the background. So something isn't quite working there. Um, Now, again, this is an argument that's used kind of in this day, and I think this one actually gets closer to the modern day version than his first argument, because the very question of free will, when we talk about say mind brain debates, that this conversation of like is moral progress possible, and things like that are always front and center in like mind brain discussions. Because, for example, if we're all just say products of I don't know chemical reactions in the brain, then we can ask the question like, what sense does it make to blame somebody for like, I don't know, some kind of prejudice or racism, some passive effect in the brain that makes them prejudicial or judgmental of other people, if that prejudice is just a passive set of chemical reactions completely outside their control. In fact, they're the driver. They're just like a post hoc passenger of what's going on in their heads. So how can you make somebody say morally blameworthy of being a racist if kind of like um the prejudicial chemical reactions are the ones kind of pushing the cart in the first place, you see. And that's something that's being talked about even in modern day. This would be Justin's version of that, except we're not talking in terms of chemical reactions, mind brain. We're talking about like prophecies and future actions. So if you don't believe you have any control of your future actions, then you're just a passenger. And so there's no good or evil. There just is what you're destined to do, kind of thing. And nobody really lives that way. And so that's a second argument.
Yeah, now you know where I got. Now you know where I got a lot of my arguments, Logos.
I can imagine. Yeah.
uh,
So I don't think the second argument works quite either. But again, that's because we've made a lot of modifications to it in the modern time. But I was struck when I read this about how close it was to the type of argument that we would see on this topic in modern times. It was actually quite extraordinary. I'm like, wow, he made this argument that long ago, huh?
yeah, and Now, one thing that I want to add here before we go into a deep dive in chapter 44 is there's something where I think it almost sounds like Molinism. He says, so that what we say about future events being foretold, we do not say it as if they come about by fatal necessity, but God foreknowing all that should be done by all men, and it being his decree that their future actions shall be recompensed to their silver value. He foretells by the spirit of prophecy that he will bestow and meet rewards according to merits and all that stuff. Maybe that wasn't it. I thought there was something I read here where it sounded like he was going almost in a proto-Molinist position, but I can't seem to find it now.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult because it does seem like his overall position wants to be kind of Molinistic. It seems like he's really relying on the idea that, I don't know, like God's watching a movie and God can fast forward and rerun the movie and whatever else in there. But like the characters in the movie acted according to their own story, and so they have their own motivations, their own desserts for what they do, and God knows how the movie's going to end. But he didn't like make people do things. That seems to be the entire point of the discussion here: is God doesn't make people do things, which is a point used to this day. They just do them, and God knows He's going to do them. Um, and that seems to be a talking point used very much so by like William Lane Craig and other Molinists. And so it wouldn't surprise me if he had knowledge of like middle knowledge and counterfactuals, which would come about later in the Middle Ages. I think he might have actually ended up agreeing with them. So
Right. Was there anything specifically about 44 you wanted to add?
nope, 44 seemed okay.
All right. Well, now we'll move on to 45. More prophecy. He said David foretold Christ would enter in heaven. Christ will rule from Jerusalem in the midst of his enemies. That's where premillennialism is coming in. We get a lot more of that with the dialogue with Trypho, so we can put a bookmark in here and get back to it later. Now, he says this, all you can do is kill us. And I immediately thought of Matthew 10:28, and do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And I think it just shows you the kind of mentality that the early Christians were in. This kind of mentality has often been psychoanalyzed as like a death wish by 20th century historians, which is grossly misunderstanding the situation. Actively seeking martyrdom was condemned throughout church history because you might not actually go through with it. But what he is saying is he's drawing this line in the sand. There was an article from Countercurrents from 2012 by a guy named Charles Upton, Spiritual Warfare Part 1, The Warrior and the Monk. And he opens up with the story. The warrior approaches the sitting monk and draws his sword. The monk remains impassive. Do you realize that I have no qualms about killing you, roars the warrior. Don't you realize that I have no qualms about dying, quietly replies the monk. And then he says, which of the figures in this story exhibits the greater courage? And of course, it's that riddle, but it really sort of highlights a similar aspect to what the Christians are saying here. Okay, 46. Christ was born 100. Now he's making a historical claim. And this is very similar to what modern apologists for Christ will do. So look at the historical record, look at all these facts that we know. What are the odds that they were made up and they weren't, countered by people that should have known better? We see this kind of intuition being used by Justin. He says Christ was born 150 years before Cyrenius. And he lived under the rule of Pontius Pilate. So technically, yeah, this is the reign of Antonius Pius. It's probably like 180 something BC. So the dialogue with Trypho, the Bar Kokhba revolt's still going on. So that's like actually 50 years earlier and probably should have come first in the list, but it didn't. And whatever. It's the way it was organized. So this was, a guy, that was running that part of the world then. And then Pontius Pilate was the governor who was around when he was crucified. Justin equates. Now he makes an interesting case. He says that like Socrates and Heraclitus and other philosophers, they're accused of being atheists. And then he says that men before Christ were wicked and opposed to him. Now the interesting thing I want to look at here is there's one of two ways you can read this, and I'll get your take on this when I'm done, Logos. He could be saying that I view these people as sort of like kindred spirits who were sort of like doing the best pagans could do before Christ, and saying that, well, you always, find the good guys and call them atheists and kill them. Or he could be making a more general statement that we don't necessarily have solidarity with Socrates and Heraclitus or the barbarians, whatever. but you're treating us just like them. And I've already made this case that we're so lawful and enlightened. That's a mistaken conflation. Now, either of those two, I think the reading could support given the broader text. What do you think, Logos?
Yeah, I actually had a question about the interpretation of this one because it seems so weird to me. So the weird part begins right here. So where does it start? Okay, let's do this. In the time of Pontius Pilate taught what we say he taught, and should cry out against us as though all men who were born before him were irresponsible. So what I got from that first clause there, ending with irresponsible, is he's trying to address the difficulty of, well, if Christ is the one way to salvation, and all these people are born so many years before Christ, because Christ was fairly recent in our history, what of all these people who are going to die and suffer, but they're not responsible for their actions? The other way he could read it is he could be saying that all people that were born before Christ were just irresponsible simpliciter, and Christ was like the first one that kind of got it. It's not super clear, but he says, let us anticipate and solve the difficulty. It's like, what difficulty, right? In the previous clause, it's not that the problem is clearly stated. So reading that again, I'm like, okay, maybe he's trying to answer the what of people before Christ problem, right? Are they saved? Um, then he says, we have been taught that Christ was the firstborn of God, and we have declared above that he is the word of whom every race of men were partakers. And those who lived reasonably are Christians, even though they have been thought atheists, as among the Greeks. Okay. So basically, what they're saying is, I think what they're trying to say is like Socrates lived reasonably, and so he would have been a Christian or a proto-Christian, even though the Greeks basically accused Socrates of being an atheist. And I think he's saying that in part because Justin and his ilk are at the time being accused of being atheists, and they're just like, "What are you talking about? Of course we're not atheists, right?" And he's looking back and seeing Socrates, and like, yeah, Socrates wasn't an atheist either, and so he's probably seeing a kindred spirit in Socrates there. But it is interesting that he's saying that these people are Christians because they lived reasonably. Um, let's see. Many others whose actions and names were declined to recount because we know it would be tedious. Okay, so even they who live before Christ and live without reason were wicked and hostile to Christ. Okay, no, that's interesting. Okay, this is where I got the question, right? Because it sounds like he's saying that like reasonable people were Christians before the time, but then he says, so that even they who lived before Christ and lived without reason were wicked and hostile to Christ and slew those who lived reasonably, but who through the power of the word according to the will of God the Father and the Son. Okay, that's a heck of a transition here. Is Socrates a reasonable pagan Christian, like it seemed he was alluding to before, or did he live without reason, were wicked and hostile to Christ?
Okay. I think I can explain this.
Yeah.
As you were reading this is what came to my mind.
Right.
Is that these proto-Christians, these reasonable pagans that lived before Christ that couldn't have known better, you killed them the same way you killed us. And so he's not saying that Socrates is an unreasonable man. He's saying that unreasonable men who hate Christ hated these proto-Christians as well.
Okay.
And that they then killed them.
It's just an oddly worded sentence. Yeah, okay.
Well, it could also be oddly translated. I mean, still, I think the most recent translation of these works is like from 1880 or something. So I don't know if
okay, I think I get it. I can get it out. So he's saying, so that even they who live before Christ, he's talking about the persecutors of Socrates. So what he's saying,
yes,
okay, he's saying that the persecution that Christians are experiencing isn't a unique phenomenon. What he's saying is like persecuting the reasonable ones, the ones that are accused of atheists and so on, is like a recurring theme. So the Socrates in his day and time was just as Christian as we are now, and is being persecuted by the same type of people for the same things. Okay, that's pretty interesting.
Well, remember, we had this discussion about salvation a few months ago, and I said something very close to that.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, you see why I like Justin. He's kind of my homie right now.
Yeah.
We're now going to go on to the next chapters, 47. So he's trying to prove prophecy. He says the desolation of the Jews, as was prophesied by Isaiah, has been fulfilled in the late war under Hadrian, the Bar Kokhba revolt. So he's saying, look, you Romans fulfilled the prophecy that we had. And then he throws a little bit of shade. He's like, but no Jew is allowed to enter Jerusalem, as the Romans would arrest any Jew who tried. He's kind of throwing some shade at them, it sounds like. but in a way that says, well, look, it's like this. Even though you rail against us and rail against Christ, you are still fulfilling prophecy by what you do. You can't escape God's providence. And he gets to that at the end of our discussion a little bit later. And when he talks about the cross, I'll get to that in a moment when we get there. But he's basically saying, look, you Romans are within the broader rubric of God's providence. You can't stop it. Even when you try to fight it, you work in accordance with it. 48. Christ was prophesied to be a healer and raise the dead. That these things were done can be confirmed in the Acts of Pontius Pilate. I guess that's a text we've now lost. I don't know of any copy of the Acts of Pontius Pilate. And then he says Isaiah predicted Christ's death. So before we go on, I just want to add, let me ask you this real quick, Logos, because a lot of this sounds like what you'll hear from like William Lane Craig and modern apologists about the historical aspect of Christ. Given that he's making references to these Romans that were in charge, that wrote about these things to the emperor, who really, if he knew they were false, he or members of his court would have written something down refuting it. To what extent do you think that lends strength to these discrete historical claims that Justin's making?
I mean, there's some claims that seems reasonable, and I mean, I think the claims that are reasonable are the type of claims that lend, like, even like Bart Ehrman and people like them to believing like that Jesus existed and some facts about his life and things like that. So things involving like governor's records and things like that. Where I think it gets a little interesting, like we talked about before, is like the prophecies. So like last time we talked about like Mary being of the lineage of David. And so like I think the governor would have record of like Jesus being in, being born in Nazareth maybe, or something like that. But genealogy records going all the way back to say David would be a little bit difficult, especially since, I mean, Israel went through how many captivities since the time of David, how many records could have been lost and so forth. And so where there seems to be reasonable records, I think the arguments are reasonable. And then where there can't be records, I think the arguments are a little tougher.
Sure. It's a layered qualitative argument here. 49. Isaiah predicted that Christ would be rejected by his people, the Jews. The Jews did not recognize their own Messiah. The Gentiles had heard nothing of Christ except him and rejected their idols. Those who blaspheme Christ should be punished. Justin cites Isaiah 5:20. Woe unto them that call sweet bitter and bitter sweet. So this is sort of like a broader commentary on what Paul talks about in Romans, that the original root, the Jews, have been supplanted by the Gentiles, but at some point they'll be grafted back on in the future. Again, a fuller commentary of that's going to be in the dialogue with Trypho. So again, a bookmark. We'll go back to that later. Chapter 50. Isaiah predicts that Christ will be numbered among the criminals, suffer for our sake, be killed for our sake. When Christ was crucified, all of his companions left him and denied him. He rose from the dead and spoke to the people of every race and nation before ascending into heaven. I'll just say this again. It's a common theme right now in this apology, that the fact that there's people from all the different nations in the world that he knew of were coming to Christ is seen as a prophetic witness to the truth that Christ had come. Because if we want to use a modern philosophical term, the principle of sufficient reason from Leibniz, well, what would be a sufficient explanation for all these heathens coming into the church and giving up their warlike ways other than a miracle with Christ's spirit, which has never happened before? That seems to be a sort of subtext argument he's making. Is there anything you want to comment on that, Logos?
No, not at the moment.
Okay. We will keep going. 51. While Isaiah prophesies that Christ will suffer, David and Daniel predicted he will rule in power and might. Yep, more premillennialism. We'll see more of that later. 52. Since those things that have been predicted having come to pass, these prophecies yet to come to pass, we Christians believe in due time will. Prophets predicted Christ would come at once. He did. Would come once. He did. They predicted he will come again. Ezekiel and Zechariah predicted the descendants of those who crucified Christ would see him and mourn at what was done. What's interesting is this has to be in the future, because the people who, even in Justin's own day, who killed Christ were already dead. Long dead. So he's referring to Israel as a nation sometime in the future, presumably the second coming. And so again, this is a futurist reading of things, and we'll see it more fully fleshed out later. 53. Christians do not make baseless claims of miraculous events. Unlike the pagans, we provide proof. Yeah, another dig at the pagans here. Christ is the Son of God. He will judge all of mankind. Testimonies of him were produced centuries before his advent. The Gentiles will be reconciled to God. The house of Jacob includes Jews and Samaritans. They have largely rejected Christ. The fact that believing Gentiles would outnumber those believing within the house of Jacob is found in Isaiah 5:41. And let's see here. Where do we have that? Okay. Sing, O barren, one who does not bear. Burst into song and shout, those who do not labor. For the children of the desolate woman will be more than the children of her that is married, says the Lord. Now, that's interesting. He uses Isaiah here, right? Well, he's trying to make a case for prophecy. But I'm going to quickly look up here. Paul in Philippians. Wait. What's this passage again? Barren. There we go. Rejoice, O barren. Paul in Galatians makes similar reference to that, and I think it is related to the Christians. Galatians 4:27. Let's go up a little bit. Yeah, it's about the two covenants. Let me just read this real quick. Galatians 4, beginning in verse 21, going to 27. Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one of a bondwoman, the other of a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and he of the free woman through promise, which things are symbolic. For these are the two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which give birth to bondage, which is Hagar. Starting from Sinai, I know, right? It's flipping the script, really trying to dig at the Jews here. From this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. It corresponds to Jerusalem, which is now in his bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, which is the mother of us all. For it is written, rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear. Break forth and shout, you who are not in labor. For the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband. So yeah, this reading of Isaiah, i.e. that refers to the Christians who are the Gentile Christians who are the true son of promise, is consistent with what we find elsewhere in the New Testament. I think the reason why he doesn't use Paul here is because he's trying to make a precedent for prophecy. The Romans could say, well, Paul's just speaking after the fact, post hoc, and he wants to avoid that. Almost done, everybody. 54. Pagan mythology is a demonic deception to create counterfeit stories to the true story of Christ. Seeing the prophecies, the demons contrive fulfillment in the gods and heroes of Greece. The prophecy by Jacob over Judah, that Judah would have descendants who washed his robes in the blood of the grape, was counterfeited by Bacchus, the god of wine. The prophecy that Messiah would ride on a foal, horse, or an ass. And the virgin birth led to counterfeits of Bellerophon and Perseus. Bellerophon and Perseus both ride Pegasus, and then there's the idea that we already read his kind of weird idea that Perseus was virgin conceived. When the psalmist predicted that God would be strong, they counterfeited with Hercules. Chapter 55, the symbol of the cross is in nature, man is shaped like a cross. And I thought of Exodus 17:11, where Moses fights the Amalekites, and I quote, and so it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed, and when he let it down, Amalek prevailed. So there is a direct biblical analogy for man in the shape of a cross. And then he says the Romans used the banner Wallexia, which are in the shape of a cross, not knowing the true power therein. So again, he's circling back to what he said in I think chapter 47, that God's plan, God's will is still expressed, even though the Romans are fighting against it. So we're done for tonight's content. Is there anything you want to say, Logos?
No, I think most of it was just more of the same prophecy stuff, which I don't know. I think we're gonna have to synthesize and make into its own stream sometime. And the stuff about free will was the first interesting stuff. I hope we get into more stuff like that. So,
well, yeah, well, he is the philosopher. I think we will. So thanks again, Logos. Again, everybody, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.